Let me take you to a place that almost never makes the headlines when people talk about the future of technology. Not Silicon Valley, not Shenzhen, not Bangalore. Picture this instead. A dusty roadside in Nairobi. A woman selling tomatoes pulls out a cracked smartphone. No bank, no branch, no paperwork. She taps a few buttons and just like that, money moves. Not cents, real income, rent money, school fees, capital. Now here's the part most people miss. That phone, that payment, that data flowing invisibly through the air, it's riding on a global deal you were never invited to negotiate. Because while the world was busy arguing about AI ethics and metaverse headsets, Africa quietly became the most valuable chessboard in global tech. And what's happening there isn't charity, it isn't development aid, and it definitely isn't accidental. It's a bargain, a trade. Infrastructure for influence, connectivity for control, opportunity with strings attached. And once you see the deal clearly, you'll never look at Africa's tech boom the same way again. Oh, and before you assume this is just another Africa is rising fairy tale, let me stop you right there. This story has winners, it has losers, and it has a bill that hasn't come due yet. For most of modern history, Africa was treated like the periphery of the global economy. Raw materials went out, finished goods came in. Value leaked away like water through cracked pipes. But sometime around the mid-2010s, something snapped into focus for global tech powers. Africa wasn't poor, it was early. In 2016, African startups raised less than $1 billion in venture capital. That's pocket change in Silicon Valley, a rounding error. According to data compiled by Partech and the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, Africa barely registered on global VC maps. Fast forward to 2022. That number exploded to $6.5 billion in venture funding. That's a 6x increase in 6 years. No other region on Earth did that without already being rich. And here's the part that makes executives sit up straight. This growth didn't come from copying Silicon Valley apps for bored millennials. It came from solving brutally real problems: payments, identity, logistics, credit, in markets where the old systems never worked. In other words, Africa didn't digitize after development, it digitized instead of it. And that's exactly why the world's tech superpowers showed up. Let's talk infrastructure, the unsexy, concrete, under-the-ocean stuff that actually runs the internet. Between 2019 and 2024, Google, Meta, Microsoft, and their partners poured billions of dollars into subsea cables and data centers across Africa. Google backed the Equiano cable, a subsea fiber line stretching from Portugal down the West African coast, landing in Nigeria, Togo, Namibia, and South Africa. According to Google, it delivers up to 20 times more network capacity than existing cables in some regions. Meta invested heavily in 2Africa, a monster of a cable system encircling the entire continent, over 45,000 kilometers, making it one of the longest subsea cables ever built. Reuters reported the project cost runs into the multi-billion-dollar range. Microsoft followed with cloud regions in South Africa and plans for more data infrastructure, while Amazon Web Services quietly expanded edge locations to serve African developers. Now pause. Big tech doesn't build this stuff out of goodwill. Subsea cables don't generate applause. They generate leverage. Whoever controls the pipes controls the platform, and Africa's pipes were wide open. But the Americans weren't alone. Enter China. Since 2015, China has financed over $23 billion in African digital infrastructure through a mix of loans, export credits, and vendor financing, according to research by the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Huawei and ZTE didn't just sell phones. They built national backbones, surveillance systems, cloud platforms, smart city grids. In Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and dozens of other countries, Chinese firms wired the digital nervous system of the state. Now here's the metaphor. Imagine you're building a city. Someone offers to pay for the roads, the power lines, and the water pipes. All you have to do is design it and promise to use their maintenance contracts forever. That's not aid, that's dependency. And both Washington and Beijing understand this perfectly. Now here's where the story turns from infrastructure to power. Africa isn't just valuable because it's connecting, it's valuable because of who is connecting. By 2035, Africa's working-age population will exceed 1.1 billion people, according to the United Nations. That's the fastest-growing labor pool on Earth. While Europe, China, and Japan are aging into economic stagnation, Africa is getting younger, faster, and more online. Let me translate that into tech language. Users, workers, data, markets, all expanding simultaneously. In Silicon Valley terms, Africa is the last place where the TAM, total addressable market, is still growing explosively. And unlike China or Europe, the regulatory walls are still being written. Which brings us to the real engine of Africa's tech boom, mobile money. If you want to understand Africa's digital leap, forget credit cards, forget bank branches, think phones. M-Pesa, the Kenyan-born mobile money platform operated by Safaricom, now processes over $300 billion in transactions every year across multiple African countries. That's according to Safaricom's annual reports. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of countries like Finland or Chile moving through a system that didn't exist 20 years ago. And it happened because Africa skipped steps. No legacy banking system to protect, no entrenched card networks to lobby regulators, no decades of paperwork culture. Money became software. And once money becomes software, everything else follows. Loans, insurance, salaries, taxes, e-commerce. This is why venture capital flooded in. According to the IMF and World Bank data, financial inclusion in parts of East Africa jumped from under 30% in the early 2010s to over 70% in less than a decade. That's not gradual reform, that's a system reboot. But here's the uncomfortable question. Who owns the rails? Because while African startups raised billions, the deepest layers of the stack, cloud services, app stores, operating systems, undersea cables, are dominated by foreign firms. Google controls Android, the operating system on over 85% of smartphones in Africa, according to StatCounter data. Meta owns WhatsApp, the default communication platform for hundreds of millions of Africans. Microsoft and Amazon increasingly host the data. This is the bargain. Africa gets infrastructure, capital, and access to global markets. Tech giants get data, users, influence, and first-mover advantage in the only region still scaling. It's not colonialism in the old sense. There are no flags, no governors. It's platform power. And it's far more subtle.
Let me make this painfully concrete. When a Nigerian fintech processes a payment, it likely runs on cloud servers owned by Amazon or Microsoft. The app was built using Google developer tools. The customer support runs through WhatsApp. The data analytics pipeline touches half a dozen foreign platforms. Even if the startup is African, the toll roads are not. This is what economists call value capture. The visible growth happens locally, jobs, offices, startups, but the invisible rents flow outward. According to McKinsey estimates, Africa's digital economy could reach $712 billion by 2050. The question isn't whether Africa grows, it's who skims the cream. And this is where geopolitics quietly enters the room. Because digital infrastructure is not neutral. China understands this. The United States understands this. Europe understands this. That's why digital policy now shows up in diplomatic meetings. The U.S. launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, explicitly positioning it as a counterweight to China's Belt and Road, including digital infrastructure. The EU rolled out the Global Gateway Strategy, promising hundreds of billions for connectivity projects, including Africa. These aren't development plans, they're alignment strategies. Who writes the standards? Who sets the rules on data localization? Who trains the engineers? Those decisions determine which ecosystem Africa plugs into for the next 50 years. And African governments know this too, which is why they're playing a careful, sometimes contradictory game, welcoming everyone, committing to no one, at least for now. But there's a human side to this story that rarely gets airtime. Because while the headlines celebrate unicorn startups and billion-dollar cables, millions of Africans are navigating a digital transformation at breakneck speed. In Lagos, gig workers depend on app platforms with opaque algorithms. In Nairobi, borrowers take instant loans with interest rates that can exceed 100% annualized, according to studies by the Central Bank of Kenya. In Kampala, content moderators review disturbing material for Western platforms, often for wages under $2 per hour, as documented by investigative reporting from Time and Reuters. This is the dark underside of leapfrogging. When systems move faster than institutions, people become the shock absorbers, and regulation struggles to keep up. Now, let me ask you something. Is this exploitation or opportunity? Because here's the twist most critics miss. Africa is not a passive victim in this deal. Local founders are smarter, faster, and more politically aware than ever before. Governments are beginning to assert data sovereignty. Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Rwanda have all introduced or strengthened data protection laws modeled partly on Europe's GDPR. African developers are building for African realities, not importing Silicon Valley assumptions that don't fit. And unlike previous eras, the talent isn't automatically leaving. Yes, there's brain drain, but there's also brain circulation. Diaspora engineers are returning. Remote work allows African talent to earn global wages without emigrating. According to a World Bank report, Africa's digital services exports have been growing at over 20% annually. That changes the power balance, slowly. Still, the central tension remains. Africa's tech boom is real, the money is real, the cables are real, but the deal is unfinished. Will Africa climb the stack, owning platforms, standards, and data? Or will it remain a high-growth user base feeding global giants? History offers a warning. Latin America industrialized without controlling finance. Eastern Europe liberalized without controlling capital flows. The result? Growth with fragility. Africa has a rare second-mover advantage, but only if it recognizes the bargain being offered. Infrastructure is never free. Someone always collects rent. So let's pull back and look at the ledger. On one side, billions in venture capital, world-class connectivity, a generation plugged into the global economy. On the other, foreign control of core digital arteries, data extraction at planetary scale, long-term dependence baked into code and contracts. This isn't a conspiracy, it's incentives. And incentives don't need villains to work. They just need momentum. Here's the real verdict. Africa's tech boom is not a miracle. It's a negotiation. A live, ongoing negotiation between a young continent hungry for growth and aging tech empires desperate for their next billion users. The outcome isn't predetermined. It will be decided by policy choices, by local ownership, by whether African states and startups treat infrastructure as strategy, not charity. Because if they don't, the continent risks becoming the most dynamic digital economy on Earth that never quite owns itself. And if you think this story only matters to Africa, think again, because this is the blueprint. This is how the next frontier gets wired. And once the cables are in the ground, changing the deal gets a lot harder. So the real question isn't whether Africa's tech boom continues, it's who it ultimately belongs to. And that's a question the rest of the world should be paying a very close attention to. Because the future of global tech might not be decided in boardrooms or labs. It might be decided in places the world used to ignore, now quietly rewriting the rules of growth.